Good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone watching this. My name is Pao Taino. I am one of the members of the core adjudication panel of this year's National Debating Championships 2024. And for this lecture, I will be talking about judging. More specifically, I'll be giving broad tips on how to improve as an adjudicator, and hopefully this can help you, especially in NDC this year. So before I move on to the bulk of what I want to talk about in this lecture, I just want to go over a few keynotes that I want people to understand before we jump into what I'm going to talk about. So a few keynotes. The first is that this is unfortunately not a replacement for a general judge briefing. So let's say, for example, you might be watching this lecture thinking that I'm going to be explaining, how judging works, or uh, like how a debate round works. Those are things that we will generally discuss in the debate and judge briefing. So, stay tuned for that one. We are going to release those quite soon. But this one is more specifically for how you could improve and become better as an adjudicator. So this kind of assumes that you know at least a bit about what judging is. And I just want to take what you already know and expand them further so you can understand better how to adjudicate debates. The second thing is that I also highly recommend that you read the World's Judge Manual for the reason that this generally provides a set of rules that you should understand when it comes to judging, as well as it giving a general overview of how judging works in, well, more specifically, British Parliamentary. So, for example, if a contradiction happens in a round, the World's Judge Manual tells you how to deal with contradictions. Or, for example, if let's say an equity violation happens in a round, hopefully that doesn't happen in anyone's rounds, but if it does happen, the Judge Manual also tells you how to evaluate that equity violation in relation to like the your adjudication or your weighing of the round. The last thing I want to note in terms of keynotes is that everything that I'll be talking about is based on my personal experience and what personally worked for me. So if some of the advice that I give to you doesn't work, I think that's perfectly fine. It doesn't mean that you're a bad judge. It just means that we have different philosophies of how we approach judging. And there are also a slew of other judge lectures that exist in the internet. It's just that I want to give my personal perspective on how I see judging, and maybe that can help some people in terms of being able to figure out different things about adjudication, whether it would be as small as just knowing what to use in order to judge, or maybe even bigger things like how to weigh and evaluate arguments. So if any of this doesn't work, that's perfectly fine. But even if only just one of these things work, I think that would be very great to hear. So now let's move on to what judging generally is. So if you were to ask me how to define judging, I personally think that judging is, or judges rather, are individuals who listen to and decide who wins a debate through the lens of an average reasonable voter. So I'll discuss more in depth what an average reasonable voter is later on. But I think an important thing to note about this one is that if you are a judge, you are ultimately the person who decides whether or not someone will break in a bubble room, or you are the person who decides whether or not a team will proceed to the next out round of a tournament. The reason why I'm highlighting this is because I think one of the core things to note about judging is that it also requires a large degree of responsibility. And judging is particularly very important and very impactful to tournaments, since in some cases, tournaments do pay you either because of your experience or because, let's say, you're part of that institution and they feel like you're qualified to be subsidized to judge and represent your institution. Whatever the case may be, there are certain cases where you are given the opportunity to judge and you're even given monetary benefits or other benefits for as long as because of your experience or because they feel like they can trust you to judge your tournament. So it's very important that you give quality adjudication as a result because that is ultimately what people expect from you. But even if you aren't paid, I think in general, the people that you will be judging in these tournaments are people who work hard to be in the room that you are judging in. These are people who spent weeks, sometimes even months, working hard to send a team to nationals, for example, or to be in the out round that they are in. So, regardless of what room you are judging in, regardless of how high stakes this room is. These people worked hard to be where they are at. These people paid to be in a tournament where they expect at least judges to be fair, judges to listen to them. So at the very least, try to do your best to judge and give due justice to the amount of effort and the amount of hard work that people put into the sport to be in where they are at. Um, and lastly, I think in some cases, you might experience this before, but the way people sometimes remember tournaments is based on the quality of judges that they experience. So they might not remember a tournament as fondly if they feel like the judges there weren't particularly the best, or if they feel like they got a decision once that they weren't very happy with. So in some cases, you also do affect the ability for that tournament to stand out, which is why it's particularly important that as a judge, you try to judge as best as possible because you also kind of represent how people view that tournament as a whole. So, a couple of things to note here when it comes to responsibility. Make sure that you are ready to judge, right? So, things like sleeping well, eating properly, and being hydrated have a huge impact on whether or not you can process arguments properly or whether or not you are presentable to the debaters, right? Because if you look sleepy, for example, in a round, that is going to be taken against you, right? And that could potentially make you demoted or give you get a really low score. Or, for example, not being able to eat properly could also lead to you generally being like very confused with what is going on in the round because you're not able to process arguments as well. So make sure that you eat at the right times. Make sure that you're drinking water. Make sure that you're not sleeping too late before a tournament. All those things are particularly important in making sure that you can understand arguments in the first place. Another thing, try your best to stay focused during the entire round. Try to avoid distractions. Turn off social media. Don't check Messenger. Don't tab stalk. Try your best to focus on the round because you might miss out on certain things that people are talking about. And lastly, understand the rules of the tournament. So if there's a mandatory POI rule, please do understand how the mandatory POI rule works. Or if the judge or tab briefing specifies a specific instruction for how judges should submit ballots, then you should be paying attention to that. You should be understanding what that process looks like. Because if you're not able to fulfill that well, then you potentially could like lead to delays in the tournament, or you could also affect the quality of rounds. If, let's say, for example, you don't enforce mandatory POI properly. So, three things: make sure that you're ready to judge, make sure that you are focused, don't try to make yourself distracted, and understand as well the particular rules found in that tournament. Okay, so now that we have a good understanding of your responsibilities as a judge and what you should be doing to fulfill that responsibility, which I do think is an important prerequisite to being a good adjudicator. The next thing that we're going to talk about is tracking and how to improve in taking note of what was said in the round. So, when I say tracking, I'm referring to the process of taking notes of what happened in the round in a way that allows you to best understand what generally happened, which is very important in being able to decide who wins or loses a round. So, the first thing I want to look at is the method by which you track a debate. So, I want to first tackle this age old question that is present within judging, which is whether or not it is better to use laptop or paper. So, there are pros and cons to using either method. Laptop, for example, allows you to just take more notes, whereas paper, for instance, is said to allow you to remember things better and also gives you more freedom on how to take notes. Because, for example, if you use paper, you could do things like draw symbols, for example, or draw sketches instead of writing down words, if it means that you can better remember what people are saying. So, clearly, there are benefits to using either laptop or paper. If you were to ask me, I personally think that it doesn't really matter whether or not you use laptop or paper. There are a large amount of judges that have done incredibly well with laptop, and there are also a ton of judges that do incredibly well with paper. And the general thing to note about this is that the device or the platform where you take notes on is merely just a tool that allows you to understand the round better. So the question is less about whether or not one or the other is generally better for judging, But more specifically, the question that you should be asking is laptop or paper better for you? Is it better for you when it comes to judging? So it's important to figure out what your preference is. And there are two things that I want to note here. The first is that you want to take time to maybe do some spars or maybe to judge some rounds to really reflect and figure out and experiment what is most comfortable for you. So some things that can help figure out what can be constituted, what can be construed as comfortable is, for example, is taking notes with paper, a lot more painful or sore for your hand? Because for some people, for example, writing too much can make their hand a lot more sore in comparison to typing. Or for example, if you want to use laptop, do you think that laptop allows you to focus, for example? Do you think that laptop could potentially lead to you just opening social media websites if you're prone to doing stuff like that? If you feel like you get distracted easily, then maybe it's probably better for you to write on paper. Or conversely, if you feel like it's very difficult to write on paper, there's no shame in using laptop. What matters is that you're comfortable with the platform that you are using and it allows for you to take notes. The other thing is that you also want to be open to changing note-taking methods and explore. So, for example, if you're using laptop, most people, at least from what I observe, use Google Docs or use Google Sheets. But there are so many other note-taking apps that exist on Windows or Mac that you could also use and also offer different features. So, for example, the note-taking app that I personally use is Obsidian, mainly because it's an app that is offline, and also it allows for me to pretty much to put two notes together so that I'm able to see two different sheets while I am judging. So I'm able to see two different sheets at the same time while I'm judging. So be open to changing note-taking methods. Sometimes the method that you use for judging, once it is changed, can have a very big effect on how well or how capable you are of understanding and deciding on a round. So these are two things that are important to note when it comes to finding your preference in tracking. So now that we have a good understanding of how to figure out how to track, how do you then track better? So a general principle that you want to take note of when it comes to tracking is you always want to maintain a balance between tracking and processing. So, like I said earlier, tracking is about taking note of what happened in the round. But the thing is, taking note of what happened in the round is only half the battle. You still need to make a decision at the end of the day. You need to condense all of the billion structural reasons you heard in the round into a general call or a general ranking that you're going to present to debaters later on. And it's important that you keep a balance between tracking and processing, because if you track too much, you'll end up with a lot of arguments and a lot of contributions from different teams that you don't have any way of figuring out which one is winning or which one is losing, which means that you're going to end up tracking the debate during your OA, but not being able to explain rigorously why you think one team is winning over the other, which some teams would not like. In other cases, however, you might process the round more than you actually track it. And the problem there is that if you process the round without tracking extensively, you might miss out on certain key analysis or responses that will have an effect on whether or not the weighing, for example, that you did for two teams is still valid, right? So it's important to maintain a balance between tracking and processing. And there are two general tips that I will provide here, which is one, to write what is necessary, and number two, to write in a way that generally helps you. So what do I mean by these two things? When I say write what is necessary, what I mean by this is not every single word that is mentioned in a speech is crucial to deciding whether or not a team wins or loses. So for the next few slides, I'll use this line of analysis as an example. So let's read the analysis. The analysis says, people on our side of the house have extensively large scales of increasing access, which leads to better economic development. So reading the statement on first glance, that's a whole lot of words. That's a whole lot of things that is being said by the speaker at the moment. But if you write this entire thing, this is going to be very time consuming, right? You have to type out each individual word. there must be a better way for you then to condense it in a way that it's just a lot easier to take note of on your notes. So here's a tip: write what is necessary. Not every word here matters. Some of these words can be sacrificed or removed. So here's an example, right? So I removed the word on of the house and extensively large scales because I don't feel like these are things that are important in order for me to understand the gist of what this argument is trying to say. Some tips here are: you want to get rid of words that you think are excessive or repetitive. So, for example, extensively large scales of also kind of just refers to increasing access or making access bigger. For example, maybe you could interpret extensively large scales as, meaning that it's not just increasing, but it's increasing largely. But in other cases, it also just means increasing. So take note of the words that people are saying. And sometimes not all words are particularly necessary to take note of. So try to figure out what is necessary in the sentence and what isn't necessary, especially if it's repetitive. And another tip is to write in a way that helps. So it's not just enough to take note to like get rid of things that you don't think are important. Write in a way that also helps you write less, right? So, for example, in the previous slide, we have the words increasing access. We can remove some letters here to make it even faster to write. There you go. From increasing access, it's now just increased app. And instead of saying it leads to better economic development, I can just do equal economic development. Because economic development already presumes that there is something developing, there is something that's improving. So you don't necessarily need to put better there, right? You can just simply say you have increasing access, which leads to economic development, and you already get the gist based off of that. So this is the end statement that you were able to track. So notice we went from this very long statement to a very succinct and one line phrase that you could put into your notes. Uh, so the way you get better at this is to really just discipline yourself to always track in this particular way every single time you judge a round. It takes time for you to get used to it, but over time, as you judge more rounds, you generally improve your ability to retain information to the point that you don't always have to write things down on your notes. And you also just generally get a better sense of like what you could better condense whenever you're taking notes. So judging a lot also helps with tracking better. So other examples of how you could condense things. So economies of scale, you can turn it into EOS. So abbreviating things essentially is another tip that I can give for you to be able to track better. All of this allows you to save time that you could use to process the round as the speakers are speaking. So now that we have a good understanding of what happened in the round and how to take note of what happened in the round, let's move on to weighing. So what do we mean by weighing? In general, when you're weighing something, right, on a weighing scale, for example, it means that you're trying to compare the value of two things together and see which among the two are necessarily better, right? So an important thing to note when it comes to weighing is there are many general differences. There are many different values that people have with regards to what makes an argument particularly persuasive. But in general, a persuasive argument always has two important qualities to them. A persuasive argument is one that is true and one that is important. And similar to what I mentioned earlier, um, just as much as it is important that when you judge, you keep a balance of tracking and processing. When you're evaluating an argument, it's important that an argument has a balance of truth and importance to the round. So, for example, in a motion like this house would ban junk food, government can go up and say, what do I say this? Government can go up and say that cabbages are green. That's true. Cabbages generally tend to be green. But is it important to the round? Like, what if the debate is about where people are healthier? Why does it matter that cabbages are green, right? Or for example, let's say opposition in this round says that it's important that we could make sure that people are healthy and we make people healthier under our side. That is quite a relevant argument, right? Because health is an issue that generally would be brought up in a motion about this house would ban junk food. But is it important? Oh, no, or rather, it is important, but is it true, right? Is it true that your side actually makes people a lot healthier? It's not enough to assert that your side makes people healthier and assume that you're winning just because that argument is more important. You need to back it up with analysis. So keep in mind, when you're weighing or looking at arguments, it should always have these two important qualities. It has to be true and it has to be important. So I want to talk about four important concepts when it comes to weighing. The first is what to look for in rounds. So there are a broad amount of things that generally help with regards to weighing that are going to be mentioned in a debate round. The first is definitions or setup. So if teams, for example, try to set up what the debate is about, like for example, in a motion again, this house would ban junk food, opening government talks about how this debate is about health. That is important because it gives you a general idea of what teams will potentially find to be important or a notable discussion point within the debate. And all other arguments that come out in the debate very likely should, or very crucially, should fall under this central question of what the debate is about. So definitions have a huge impact, or setup has a huge impact on how the debate informs you of what is particularly important when you judge it later on. Another thing is framing and characterization. So sometimes teams might characterize that certain actors are important, like the poor, for example, or maybe women, or maybe gender minorities, for instance. These characterizations are important because they provide a good idea to judges as well on what they should believe to be important or urgent to consider. So obviously, if a team explains that a certain actor is vulnerable, it's easy for you then to understand or derive that this actor might actually be important in comparison to other actors who may not be as vulnerable or as important as this actor. So characterization is also quite important in being able to figure out which arguments are necessarily more or less important within the round. Another one is metrics. So sometimes teams would say that their argument wins on scale, and that scale is important because it ties back better to the general point of the debate. Those are things that are also important to note. It helps you figure out reasons for why certain teams are winning or losing, so take note of that. And of course, direct engagement is very important. Let's say, for example, government responds to opposition bench, and opposition doesn't respond to these responses. I think those responses will play a huge role in deciding whether or not opposition loses, because those responses might be well analyzed enough to cast a shadow of doubt on key gaps present in the opposition bench that makes them lose. So direct engagement is also particularly important to note when it comes to weighing. Another concept that I want to talk about is when to be explicit or when to be implicit. In other words, when to step in. So I know for a fact that the word "step in" is a bit of a scary word when it comes to judging, right? We're always told that we shouldn't be stepping in and around, but unfortunately, there are going to be cases where teams are just being vague to the point that there are no clear metrics that allow you to figure out who is clearly winning or who is losing. And in those particular instances, you are given the right to step in if it means that you're able to figure out who is winning or losing. At the end of the day, an important thing to note is that as a judge, you are never entirely passive or active. So, on one hand, you shouldn't be too active to the point that you are imposing what you think is the correct version of the debate to debaters, especially if no one in the round agrees with your understanding of what the debate should be. But at the same time, you are never entirely passive. That is to say, just because teams, for example, call out other teams for not having a comparative doesn't particularly mean that you have to believe that right away. You, as a judge, should still step in and see whether or not this call out is true. Is it true that government doesn't have a comparative? Is it true that this argument weighs over opening because it proves a different impact? You should never take these things on face value. You should still assess arguments based on how it actually works within the round, and you should, to a certain extent, be a perfect blend of both passive and active. So how should you go about that, right? The first is that um for the most part, you want to be explicit if the clash can be judged based on material already found in the round. So refer to my previous slide over here, right? If there are definitions, responses, etc., that give you a clear idea of who's winning the round, then use those to adjudicate the debate. So, for example, if so let's say, for example, this house would ban junk food. If government gives an argument for why they keep people healthy, and opposition gives an argument for why they also keep people healthy, but government explains why their impact on health is more tied or more relevant to the general context of the debate, that is a clear thing that you could use to weigh the argument. Government said this, this is their weighing, this was not responded to by opposition bench, which means that it's assumed to be true. This was also well proven by government, which is why it wins over opening opposition, right? So sometimes material is already present in the round that already gives you an idea of how you should be weighing things. It's just a matter of citing those things in your oral adjudication. But there are also times where there's no direct engagement in clashes. Like, for example, government might give an argument about health, and opposition might give an argument about, let's say, safety. Um, at this point, you have to see if there are analyses that can help you decide who wins or loses. So again, maybe government has a different impact than opposition, and there's no direct engagement between the two on which impact is more important. But maybe the characterization of the debate suggests that one impact is more important than the other. Like, one characterization in the debate might suggest that there's an increasing rate of people getting diseases, which makes the health impact more important than security. Even if teams don't necessarily point it out, the link is already there. There is already something present in the round that can help you in deciding who wins or loses. Might as well use that in order for you to adjudicate or decide on who wins or loses the clash. So take note of things that generally can help you decide who wins or who loses. If there's no direct engagement, that is where you can, to a certain extent, step in. And another thing here is you also want to be very clear with when there is no direct engagement and when you have to necessarily step in. So in the event that you feel like you need to rely on implicit reasoning, or you have to rely on an understanding of an argument that may not seem accurate to what teams generally said, you need to do a lot of explanation for why your interpretation or your weighing is particularly valid in that particular instance. Okay, third concept, how to weigh extents. So when we say extents, we are generally referring to the literal meaning of an argument. What is, to what extent, or how literal the argument is, how literal the meaning can be derived, right? So what is an example of when extents is most applicable? Let's say there are two arguments in a round. One argument talks about how X impacts minorities. Another argument talks about how Y impacts ethnic minorities. At first glance, this argument might sound similar, but if you look at the extents of both impacts, they are actually functionally different. When we say that you are impacting minorities, this means that you are impacting broadly all minorities that exist. So not just ethnic minorities, but gender minorities, racial minorities, those who are not economically well off, for example. And when you say that you are impacting ethnic minorities, the extent of that is that this argument or this claim only benefits ethnic minorities. You cannot say that this claim also benefits women. You cannot say that this claim also benefits, those who are not relatively well off, for the reason that they are not covered by this impact, because that is not the extent of that impact. So extents are particularly important because it allows for you to be able to weigh arguments, especially in instances where it might not be very obvious what the difference of two arguments are, right? So for example, in this scenario, let's say you're trying to figure out who's winning between OG and CG, and you're trying to see if CG has an extension. Opening government says that they create more jobs. Closing government says that their analysis exponentially increases employment. Again, at first glance, both claims might sound similar, But, or rather, actually in this case, both arguments might have a difference between one and the other, right? Especially since closing government not only uses different words, but they also add the term exponentially. But if we look at it via extents, both of them do the same job of explaining that their team is able to generally increase the amount of jobs present. And even if closing government explains that they exponentially do so, they needed to explain to what extent do they exponentially do so. Because at least based on the understanding of the argument, closing government pretty much just increases the amount of jobs. Even if it's exponential, it is still a general increase in jobs, which is something that opening government already runs. So, as you could see here, by just looking at the extents of arguments, you could already see or you could already derive what the potential decision of this round should be, which is why particularly extents matter and why it's important for you to practice identifying the extents of arguments. So, a tip for this is to generally look at the literal meaning of arguments and try your best not to interpret it in different ways. Use the words of the debaters, use the specific end impact or end conclusion of the statements that they are saying. Final concept, the average reasonable voter. This is the core tenet that pretty much underpins how to judge in general. So some important notes about the average reasonable voter. So for one, an average reasonable voter reads headlines of newspapers. So broadly speaking, an average reasonable voter would know that, at least as of this recording, Biden is the president of the US, but they may not be familiar, for example, with how Biden's economic policies work, because those are things that are a lot more technical. Those are things that are a lot more specialized. But furthermore, an average reasonable voter can understand and follow complex concepts if they are explained. This is important because the core thing about being an average reasonable voter is that you are, at the end of the day, beholden to how teams explain certain things to be true or important. So even if you know for a fact that certain claims are wrong, you cannot step in and say, I think this team loses because I personally think they are debating the debate wrong. Or in other cases, you cannot impose your understanding of what the debate should be about. So for example, if you notice that teams are not debating the principle, are not talking about principles in that this house believes that debate, even though this house believes that debate generally should be about whether or not something is justified or not, you cannot penalize teams and say that they are losing just because they don't talk about the principle. At the end of the day, it's relying on how teams set up the certain things to be important. At the end of the day, it's relying on what teams frame out to be crucial or not within the round. So you can follow complex concepts, but you should not necessarily always impose your understanding or your definition of what you think is particularly important in the debate. Allow debaters to be able to explain that to you. Allow yourself to be open to what teams generally say to be important. So, how do you then better embody the average reasonable voter? There are three things that I want to note. The first is that it generally helps to learn more about the world. So, in general, it helps to learn about, different things, not just in pop culture, for example, but even in things like finance, in law, etc. I think in general, this is a good tip because it allows you to better process rounds. You might experience that there are certain rounds or certain themes that you generally struggle to judge, like finance, for example, and sometimes being able to read up on financial terms, like quantitative easing, for instance. Sometimes it just helps you fast process the round a lot faster because you're not taking time to understand what they are trying to mean by quantitative easing if you already know what quantitative easing necessarily is. The other thing is that you should also read up on different perspectives around the world. So I think this is generally important because it also just allows for you to truly be an average reasonable voter. Because at the end of the day, there are still a number of things that are present within the world that are still particularly debatable. So, for example, whether or not ChatGPT is a good thing to be on the rise. You might think that it's not good that ChatGPT is on the rise, but there are also people that claim that ChatGPT is a good thing for society, which is why certain academies, for example, are adopting it. So, whatever the case may be, it's generally helpful to read up on perspectives of whether or not ChatGPT is good or bad, because if you encounter a debate that is about ChatGPT, at least if you understand the different perspectives around it, you can approach the debate with a lot more open mind, and thus you are less likely to overcredit or undercredit certain contributions. Lastly, observe debates from different circuits around the world. It's always generally helpful to understand different debating styles. So, like different ways in how people set up debates, different ways in how people interpret things like fiat. It just gives you a general idea of like how debate can differ from person to person. Because at the end of the day, there are different ways to approach debate. And if you want to be an average reasonable voter, you have to be amenable or you have to be open to all of them. So now that I've covered how to weigh arguments, let's move on to panel discussion. So we already have a good idea of who's winning or losing the round. We have a good idea of what occurred in the round. Let's now talk about how to discuss it with other people. So an important thing to keep in mind about discussions is that number one, the point is to come to a consensus and not to just talk about the round. You might have strong opinions about the round. You may have things that you want to talk about, and that's perfectly fine and valid. But at the end of the day, the point of deliberating is not to just talk about things that you found interesting, but is about being able to help one another get to a general consensus or get to a general conclusion of what you think is important in the round so that you can give an oral adjudication later on. But also, you only usually have 15 or 20 minutes to deliberate. Usually, the reason why we impose a time limit like that is because of logistical concerns. Like sometimes tournaments will get delayed if we allow deliberations to go on for like up to an hour. But also, generally speaking, if you tend to deliberate for too long, it might come to a point where you might be forgetting what actually occurred in the round. So there are certain cases where if you deliberate for too long, it comes to a point where people are deliberating on a different understanding of what actually happened in the round. So usually the 15 to 20 minutes rule is imposed so that the round is still fresh in the minds of all the panelists. So how do you then do this? So as a panelist, there are 4 general tips that I want to introduce. The first is, it is always generally helpful to have an initial call ready. So when you go into the deliberation, you don't necessarily need to be sure of your call, but in general, it's good to at least have a good idea of who's first, second, third, and fourth. And if you're still not sure about the call, you could always flag it to the chair. Tell them, hey, I think this call is quite contentious. I think we can discuss this, etc. Second thing, take notes and pay attention to what is happening in the deliberation. So follow what judges are assuming to be important. Follow what judges generally agree upon to be true about the round, because those things could be very crucial in terms of informing how you should then approach the round, how you should then weigh certain contributions, how you should adjust your reasoning or adjust how you engage, etc. Another thing, answer questions directly. So if the chair tells you, can you weigh opening government and opening opposition? Strictly weigh only opening government and opening opposition. Do not bring in any other team. Do not bring in closing government. Do not bring in closing opposition. Even if you feel like they are potentially important to deciding OG and OO, do not bring them up. Focus specifically on what opening gov and opening opposition talked about. Because at the end of the day, comparisons in British Parliamentary are pairwise. They don't necessarily need to always include other teams when you're weighing 2 different teams. Lastly, if you disagree with the call, it's important to always flag what you need to believe in order for you to be convinced. So for example, if other judges give it to opening gov over opening op, and you feel strongly about opening opposition winning the debate, sometimes it helps to generally pose a question to the deliberation or to the panel as a whole that gives them an idea of what you are still unsure of. So let's say there's an argument, for instance, that opening op doesn't respond to. Maybe it might be helpful to raise that to the discussion. Say, hey, there's this argument that I think opening op has that is still standing. That is what's currently preventing me from giving the win to government bench. Maybe someone can help me out here. All right. So those are some general tips on how to panel better. Okay. So as a chair, 4 general tips as well. Number 1, if people have varying calls, a tip that I would usually do is I would tackle the debate chronologically. So I'll go from opening gov and then opening op and then closing gov and then closing op. But as to what's the most ideal, it's generally up to you. I also encourage you to experiment on this. Number 2 is you always want to give everyone ample time to speak. Not everyone has to speak for each clash. So let's say For example, if you're weighing opening gov and opening op, you might want to prioritize those that think it's contentious. And for those who think it's quite clear, maybe you can leave them for later classes to talk. All right? This is just to make sure that things are a lot more efficient. Take notes as well as a chair. That's also quite important. So just as how a panel should take notes, you as a chair should also take notes so that you can engage with what other people say in the round. And lastly, it's perfectly fine to split. You don't always need to have a consensus or unanimous call. At the end of the day, debate is to a certain extent somewhat subjective. People are always going to have different interpretations of what happened in the round. It's perfectly fine for you to have a different interpretation. It just simply reflects how contentious that round particularly is. So, on the worst case, by 20 minutes, you still don't have a unanimous call. Just call a vote. If you're the minority, that's perfectly fine. Those are things that are normal. When deciding speaker scores as well, do not vibe it out. Use the scale. It relies on you having a good idea of what the general problems are in the round. So I highly encourage using what you understand from the round to decide where the round falls on the scale and identify a specific range. Read the description for that particular range, right? So for example, if you are giving a debate a 79 to 82, that assumes that for the most part, a lot of the arguments that were brought out are relevant. They're quite important. They're quite proven, but there are some parts about it that can easily be responded to, right? Like it's still very easy to think of responses to these particular claims. So that's how to use the range. And an important thing, scores on the far end are on the far end for a reason. It's not very common to see speaks higher than 86, for example. It's also not very common to see speaks lower than a 70. You don't always have to use those particular values when assessing or evaluating rounds, unless it really calls for it. Okay, last thing, giving oral adjudications. So when you're giving an oral adjudication, think about the decision and your thoughts on the round during the round, not after the round is done. So like what I said earlier, when you are judging a round, you should be balancing between tracking and processing. You should already be thinking about the decision and putting it into writing before you move on to the deliberation. So by the time you get into the deliberation, at least have a general sentence or statement that pretty much captures what you think of each clash in the round. And any structure is fine. You can do chronological, which is from opening gov to closing op, or you could do first to fourth or fourth to first. What matters is you do all comparisons. So you compare OG to OO. When you compare CG, it's to both OG and OO. And when you compare CO, it's to all the other teams that spoke before them. Tips for giving an OA, it always helps to have a general outline. Always signpost where you are in the oral adjudication, and always try to keep it within a time limit. Even if it means that you have to sometimes sacrifice certain things, like certain arguments that aren't as tangential or important to the round, that is perfectly fine. On the worst case that some teams might have qualms about it, you can just flag that, well, this argument was not particularly proven to be important. I think teams generally drop that within the round, so I will just mention it briefly and move on. And of course, signpost all the time. Always let the teams know what particular class you are already at in the oral adjudication. Last thing, I want to go over some extra tips when it comes to judging. Number one is do not overthink your allocation. At the end of the day, you can never read the minds of Cap. You can never read my mind, Jill's mind, Akeem's mind, Rafi's mind, or CJ's mind. Sometimes you're a panel because we think that you're very important to be in as a panel because we want you to check the chair. Other times we might be allocating you to chair a particular room because we also think that this room is a Union Cup bubble or an open bubble, which either one of those bubble rooms are very significant and important in the round or in the tournament rather. Another thing, be confident in judging. In case you still feel afraid of judging because you feel like people might get mad at you, do note that debaters also tend to be self-aware. They tend to also know when they made mistakes, when they feel like their arguments are not perfect. And on the worst case that you feel like some teams are being too aggressive to you, you always have people to fall back on. You always have equity in tournaments who are more than happy to chat if ever there's a problem. So if ever anything happens, people are going to help you. People are going to back you up. So don't be afraid to judge. And lastly, it also helps to debate every once in a while. It gives you a general perspective of how debaters see adjudication. And it also helps you improve in being able to process arguments. Because as you improve in critical thinking and responding to arguments, for example. You also improve in like weighing arguments and stuff. So those are all the things that I have for this judge lecture. Thank you very much to everyone who watched. If you have any particular questions, feel free to leave a comment in the YouTube video. And good luck for NDC. Thank you very much.